On the 25th of January, the 198th Infantry Division was deployed in a defensive posture facing west, not east. The extension of the badly decimated division stretched for more than 25 kilometers. Our regiment had to take over the southernmost sector, which was about 10 kilometers wide, loosely connected to a regiment from the adjacent 34th Infantry Division to the south. We defended the northwest rim of Votilevka and the open area on both ends of the town. As Grazer described it, the 198th Division was situated at the NW tip of the advanced front, exactly at the point from which, according to prior experiences, an attacker would set out to complete an encirclement. Its lines were sparsely manned and thin, without any depth, without sufficient reserves of its own, without anti-tank defences, without alternate fallback positions. That about sums it up. Our mission was critical, but our position was tenuous indeed. Late in the evening of the 25th of January, I visited the soldiers of the 6th Company, who were hunkered down in foxholes they had hastily scratched out in the open field. The company commander, Lieutenant Ottowitz, a young officer with the congenial manners of a well-educated Austrian, reported brisk action by the opponent right after dusk. Together, we listened to the typical clanking noise of tank tracks and even isolated voices from the opponent's side. They were surprisingly close, too. At about midnight, I returned to my command post. Since I had not been out of my clothes for weeks, I decided to at least take off my boots, as well as my jacket and trousers. I fell asleep right away. At 4:40 a.m. on the 26th of January, a tremendous barrage came down on Votilevka, not only in our area, but on a sector more than 30 kilometers in width. The Russians must have employed hundreds of batteries in the artillery preparation for their attack. Artillery shells of all calibers crashed into our positions. Waves of 122mm rockets added their howling cacophony too, before slamming into the earth around us. The enemy paid particular attention to the coordinating point where our division's lines joined those of our neighbour to the north, the 88th Infantry Division. It was a major attack. We had only seconds to grab our weapons and clothes and to dive into a deep, narrow ditch, which, as a precaution, we had dug out behind our house and covered with wood beams, dirt, and a thick layer of straw. A few minutes later, our cottage was already broken into pathetic pieces. From now on, we could do nothing but crouch in our trench and hope. Just before leaping into the shelter, my Lieutenant Armbruster got his hands on a bottle of cognac, which, after the first seconds of shock were over, was soon passed around. Its contents helped deaden the terrific pounding shock that went on and on and on. At 6 a.m. sharp, exactly 80 minutes later, the devastating barrage stopped suddenly. Dead silence prevailed. Knowing that the soldiers of the Red Army started their attack with tactical correctness, right after the end of their preparatory barrage, we broke out into the open and saw that everything in Votilevka, with a very few exceptions, was razed to the ground. Even the few trees had become stripped skeletons. Only the remains of a couple of chimneys still stood in the smoking, greyish-black moonscape of huge craters. As we fortunately found out afterwards, my battalion, as well as our regiment's 1st Battalion, defending the outer perimeter of the town, did not suffer substantial losses. But my 6th Company, deployed outside of the town, was totally overrun. According to statements from the few infantrymen who escaped, the young company commander and his messengers were taken prisoner. These surviving Lancers of the 6th Company also reported that the Russian infantry and tanks broke through in great numbers between Votilevka and the 34th Infantry Division to the southeast. There was only some minor battle noise to hear from the outskirts of the town. Apparently, after all the fireworks they had expended on the village, the Russians thought an attack on them was a waste of time and resources. From the regiment's command post, which was about 5 kilometers behind us in Repki, our regimental physician appeared to establish communications. Dr. Stochdorf seemed relaxed, grinned amiably, and asked nosy questions. He reported that Repki, too, had been hit heavily by the Russian artillery, with about the same results as the barrage on us. After I informed him that we did not yet have a clear picture of the situation, he had his Kubelwagen turned around and drove back to report to the regimental commander. Dr. Stockdorf was typical in my experience. During the whole war, I never personally witnessed any physician or clergyman who was not exemplary in the practice of his duties. The Roman Catholic chaplain of our division even took part, naturally unarmed, in dangerous assaults. Our physicians, often enough, were surprisingly good at soldiers' tactical tasks, and our staff physician was no exception. Without any special preparations, he would have been fully capable of leading a battalion or even a regiment. These qualities not only helped greatly in the command and control of our units, but also naturally earned the even greater respect of U.S. combat infantrymen. Next, we marched towards the enemy, to the command post of the 1st Battalion, commanded by Hauptmann Dr. Major. We were perplexed beyond all limits, and full of joy, to find his cottage completely unharmed in the midst of this lunar landscape. We entered and found the commander, his officers and messengers still a little pale, but again composed, conducting a command and staff meeting. Unlike us, these lazy guys had not even bothered to dig foxholes, but survived the barrage by prostrating themselves on the floor of their cottage, covered by woolen blankets, which we still puzzled about afterwards. They could not establish a clear picture about the situation on the outskirts of the town either. As it was established later on, the tremendous barrage didn't do much damage where they were, but the horses and vehicles left in the town were a complete loss. As Grazer describes, some battalions and companies of the division held on to their strongpoints and repelled the attacks of the enemy infantry during the late morning in heavy fighting. Yet the enemy tanks in their first approach, protected by the fog, had already broken through the weak front between the towns and penetrated the artillery positions. Votilevka was retained, involving the 1st and 2nd Battalions of Regiment 308 in heavy battles. The regimental staff of Regiment 308, together with the 7th, 8th and 10th batteries of the Artillery Regiment 235, repelled a tank attack on Repki. I have to say that the Russians most likely could have taken Votilevka before noon, if they had seriously attempted to do so. But they reasonably decided that it was smarter to avoid assaulting an objective which would fall in due course without a fight. As a result of these massive attacks, on the 28th of January 1944, the Russians closed their encirclement of our 11 and 62 Corps in a pocket around Cherkassy. The 88th Infantry Division, until then our neighbour to the right, was pushed back to the north, and our 198th Infantry Division was pushed back to the south and southeast. A huge gap resulted in the middle. To face the new challenge, we executed an almost exact turn by 180 degrees, so that our front was again facing east. It now ran between Racino and Vinograd, with the Grenadier Regiment 308 defending on the right flank of the division. This slide southward occurred during the night of 26, the 27th of January, in the teeth of bitter resistance from many Russian units. Only on the 11th of February did the costly attack to break through to the encircled units begin. Our Grenadier Regiment 308 was supported by many tanks from the 3 Panzer Corps. After a 15-minute barrage by artillery and heavy Nebelwerfers, as well as repeated sorties against enemy positions near Zhubeny Stav by a squadron of Stukas, we started to move forward. Subsequently, we seized Zhubeny Stav and drove to the edge of the town of Jablonovka. There, because of some crisis in Vinograd, we relieved one of our sister regiments, Grenadier Regiment 326, that had already penetrated that area and now had to push on to Vinograd itself. On the night of 11, the 12th of February, our regiment received orders to attack beyond Jablonovka toward Tikonovka, because during the previous afternoon, enemy elements there had destroyed the support convoy of one of our panzer divisions. My colleague from the 1st Battalion and I shared the opinion that our completely exhausted men just could not physically accomplish this mission, which would have to be performed at night in knee-deep mud. This estimate was fortuitous on our part, as it turned out, because the regimental and division commander insisted unbendingly on the execution of this order, and they therefore were forthcoming in the provision of significant armoured support for the operation. For my men and I, the attack on Tikonovka was an exact repeat of the night attack on Luka. We directed the tanks through deep mud and stifling darkness with green-lensed flashlights. Then it began. Pulling up on line before Tikonovka, the Panthers first poured machine gun fire into the town, igniting many buildings with tracers. Again, these burning buildings illuminated the objective for us. As targets became visible, the long 75mm cannon of the Panthers sowed havoc among the stunned Russian defenders. By the time we, the infantry, surged forward into the town, the Russians hardly put up a fight at all. Casualties among our men were practically non-existent, and we took numerous prisoners before the night gave way to daylight. This attack might not have been possible to execute during daytime. The 3rd Panzer Corps had advanced about 30 kilometers and stood only about 13 kilometers from the encirclement, on the general line Lysyanka Oktyabre Chishintsi. But the energy of its attack faded. Therefore, on the night of 16, the 17th of February, the encircled corps got orders to break out. This was ultimately accomplished only with the sustainment of painful losses of men, as well as the total forfeiture of heavy material. Some 2,000 to 25,000 of our soldiers were finally saved behind the thin security lines we formed. Once again, one of these stupid orders to halt, this time for 2 army corps to stick to the Dnieper, led to a catastrophe, which Cherkassy was, in spite of spectacular breakouts. It was unimaginable and simply irreplaceable, considering the men and material we lost by stubbornly sustaining positions and so-called strongholds since Stalingrad. The Russians could have avoided their big losses in 1941 also, had they always withdrawn in time into the enormous depth of their land. By 1942, they often did this quite well. We had lost any initiative. The Manstein masterwork, to deliver devastating blows even during a retreat, was now, in 1944, no longer possible due to the absence of the strength essential for this sort of counterpunching. Even though the Russians had failed to destroy all the German forces in the pocket at Cherkassy, they attacked our division on the 5th of March in large scale, similar to the attack on Votilevka. This time our division was pushed back into the position from which it had started in 1941. My battalion was deployed in Kemeriskoye and repulsed all attacks for several days, even those involving tanks, until that early morning of the 5th of March. The Russians now declined to bypass towns or villages. When the artillery bombardment ceased, they moved south along both sides of my command post. For the time being, we remained crouched in our cottage, and when my adjutant asked me, "Herr Hauptmann, what are we going to do now?" I answered, "The Commander-in-Chief Hitler is trembling with anticipation." At least we had kept a bit of grim humour. In the dense fog and smoke, we were able to withdraw continuously in consonance with the Russians' attacks. The division parried strong Russian thrusts with its weak forces during the daytime, and at night it withdrew to the next defensible positions, ultimately reaching the vicinity of Uman on the 9th of March. This was where we then experienced the grand finale. By this time, the Russians had already physically cut off the regiments of the 198th Infantry Division from the division command post. Consequently, the division commander radioed an order placing all fighting units of the division under the control of Oberst Kaiser, commander of Grenadier Regiment 326. Just when I turned up to meet the Oberst to establish contact, the following radio message arrived from the division. "There are 40 Russian tanks on the highway from Novo-Arkhangelsk to Uman. Attention." Oberst Kaiser sarcastically replied, "What do you mean, attention? Do we have to stand at attention when those things get here?" The Oberst was well known for his dry sense of humour and for his unflinching bravery. It was determined that we should break out during the night towards the south, which could be possible because, until now, the enemy had only tanks with relatively few infantry units in place. We could exfiltrate between tanks much more easily than through the lines of dug-in infantry. During the late morning, I had, as a precaution, ordered reconnaissance to find possible points for crossing a small river behind us, the Umanka. The leader of the recon patrol reported everything to be in order. The little river could be crossed by moving over an embankment with a small bridge. But late that afternoon, the Russians attacked directly with many tanks, and regrettably, we had nothing with which to counterattack. So I ordered my battalion to withdraw across the river in small units and to reassemble in the woods to the southwest. When we gathered at the bank for the crossing, we were hit by a wicked surprise. What we found was not a little river anymore. The water of the Umanka had risen by at least 2 meters and also flooded the embankment by almost a meter in height. The current was so powerful that a man by himself could hardly get a foothold on the embankment. But we had no choice. If the reinforced battalion of Russian tanks reached the hills near the Umanka's banks, they would finish us off in a few minutes. I was first to enter the water, up to my hips, and ordered every other man to grab the hand of the one ahead of him without closing up too much, to prevent the upstream water from building up pressure against this wall of men. This technique occurred to me from my peacetime pioneer training. To put it mildly, I had to summon every gram of authority I had to convince my men to do this. There was quite some panic among many of the infantrymen because of the torrential waters and the danger of being pulled off the embankment and swept away to drown. One had to keep a meter's distance, and nobody in the chain could let the hand go of the man in front of him, at whatever the cost. Even Susie, my beautiful riding horse, was actively involved in this crossing. When, in spite of all the warnings, one of my soldiers was pulled from the levee and got carried away by the river, I chased Susie into the water and fished out the unfortunate man by yelling for him to hold onto the horse's tail. Some horse-drawn carriages were out of luck. One was pulled from the embankment and sank immediately in the water's vortex. Regrettably, it was loaded with wounded soldiers, for whom there was no salvation. Another one tipped over towards the oncoming river, and was also pulled by the torrents, only to be caught under a bridge a long way downstream. The draft horses could, in their agony, only keep their heads above water, and I had to shoot them, which was very hard for me. Yet it spared the dear animals a far more torturous death. This was one of the darkest days of my life. As my battalion, or more precisely what was left of it, reached the south bank, I gave orders to the senior company commander to gather the men in the woods behind us and wait. In the manner described, I personally, along with my Susie, picked up several non-swimmers from the north bank, among them also a couple of our highways. Afterwards, when I reached the woods, the battalion had already marched on in daylight, contrary to my explicit order, and suffered heavy losses from fire from Soviet tanks. The battalion had become dispersed and was decimated. The remnants were later absorbed by other units. Later I took no measures regarding this stupid disobedience. What would have been accomplished? What was done, and it would not have helped anyone. Later the same year, the company commander responsible for this, a Hauptmann, was badly wounded during an attack in the Vosges mountains. He died a few weeks later in a hospital in his Swabian homeland. Down to this day, I am unable to explain what could have caused the sudden surge of the Umanka's waters. Someone must have blown up a dam or opened a sluice of some sort. Whether it was done by the Russians to hamper our withdrawal or by a German commander in hopes of impeding the Russian pursuit could not be determined. A few infantrymen reached the woods together with me, and we waited for dusk, because between our little forest and the nearest woodland was an open field of at least 500 meters width, which slightly ascended from the riverbed of the Umanka. On the upper rim of this open space, a few Russian tanks were already in position. Any attempt to cross the field in daylight would have been suicide. We avoided any unnecessary movement that could have drawn the attention of the Russians upon us. I will never forget one sad and painful experience while we were waiting. Over and over again, at short intervals, we heard agonizing calls for help from badly hurt infantrymen, whom we unfortunately could not help. If we had tried, the Russians would have shot us to pieces across a veritable shooting gallery. After some time, we watched Russian tanks with infantry mounted on them moving in the direction of the calls for help. For us, condemned to observe this without the ability to help, this was also a terrible ordeal. At the onset of darkness, we walked out of the woods. I impressed on my men the importance of ignoring any challenges by the Russians, and the criticality of simply pressing on. I led my Susie by her rein. First, nothing happened, but shortly before the edge of the opposite forest came the first Russian call. None of us made a sound. After the second, more energetic challenge, our small group opened wild, random fire into the woods just in front of us, directly into the midst of the Russians, who dispersed and fled into the forest. As it developed, my little group broke through the encirclement without the loss of one man. Even my faithful Susie, who once before saved my life and freedom, was safe. A few weeks earlier, I had ridden toward what I thought was a German unit to make contact with its commander. I was mistaken. The mass of soldiers in white snow camouflage marching towards me made me suspicious. The moment I stopped, the first bullet buzzed by my ear. The distance to the leading Russian was only about 150 meters. With lightning speed, I turned around without having to direct Susie, for she seemed to know what it was all about. In a few seconds, we were safe behind the nearest cover. After the lucky breakout by the remnants of my battalion, and after almost an hour of laborious trudging through dense brush, we reached the southern end of the forest. There was complete silence, and one could only hear the yelping of dogs in the distance. That meant that there must be a village out there somewhere nearby. We moved toward the barking until we could make out the silhouette of a village in the dark. We moved on, very carefully, up to the first cottages. Not a soul stirred, and there was no sign at all of the presence of Russian or German soldiers. We moved into the village until we saw an older man standing in front of one of the little wooden houses. We asked the elderly gent about Ruski Soldat, and he shook his head in the negative. Then I asked him about Germansky Soldat, and he nodded and said, "Da," and pointed to a small hut. Who can describe our joy when, after knocking, an older hauptmann from our regimental staff appeared in the doorway? Completely exhausted, he had seemingly accepted his fate and was now relieved and happy to confront not the expected Russians, but comrades from his own regiment. We knew that we could not trust the civilians anymore, because they were threatened with draconian punishment for assisting the Germans in any way. They would undoubtedly report our presence to the nearest Russian command at the first opportunity, and they could not be far away. We moved on and came to a halt only near the last cottages at the southwest end of the village. We placed sentries there. The others crept into two little huts and got rid of their water-soaked winter clothes to dry them out on the giant stoves in the peasant huts. An old Russian couple, without any sign of interest in what was suddenly happening around them, sat at the table and occasionally exchanged a few softly spoken words. Incidentally, we made the surprising discovery that our winter battle dress, quilted with man-made fibres, was almost waterproof. I found that my uniform and undergarments remained quite dry. Suddenly, one of the sentries came in and reported engine noise from the nearby village street. A patrol was sent out immediately and returned shortly, accompanied by a liaison officer from our division. There was great joy and surprise on both sides. The lieutenant informed us that the commanding general had been sending out motorized and dismounted patrols continuously since afternoon to try and locate the scattered and isolated fragments of his division. On the 12th of March, the 34th Moserland, the 4th Mountain, and the 198th Württemberg-Baden Infantry Divisions were mentioned in the daily Wehrmacht report. It was a swan song, really, because not much was left of these three divisions. The next morning I reported to the division staff. Since I literally did not have a unit to command, I became, as of now, a duty soldier at the disposal of our division commander, who, for the time being, took over the provisional corps headquarters called Korpsgruppe von Horn. Divisions, corps, or armies were now fairly meaningless titles. In reality, they were totally burned-out shells without any significant fighting power. During the ensuing days, if we had a chance for a rest, it was only when the enemy regrouped his units, or waited to move up his heavy weapons, or halted to conduct mechanical maintenance for his tanks. Since I was without a command, General Lieutenant von Horn used me as a sort of utility player, performing various tasks requiring an officer with a fair amount of combat experience. First, I had to supervise an advanced command post with a couple of messengers. The main command post had already displaced further south. Since during daytime one could quite clearly survey the terrain ahead, we were practically safe from surprises. But in the late afternoon, the Russians appeared in large numbers on the horizon, including a horse cavalry unit. They were moving directly toward us with alarming speed. By field telephone, I informed the command posts of each of the divisions of our provisional corps that I was compelled to pull the plug on my connection and withdraw to the new command post of the Corps. General Hermann Bernhard Ramke personally came on the line when I spoke with the headquarters of the 2nd Parachute Division. He ordered me to stay and to pick up the fight against the attacking enemy. I could not change his mind by telling him that I was alone with only a few messengers and telephones, and probably could not offer any real resistance. He said, "You will stay and you will fight. Understand? I am going to stay and fight here too." Since the Russians had come dangerously close in the meantime, and had even bypassed us to the west, I ignored Ramke's directive and ordered the phone disconnected, after which we rapidly withdrew. After this, by the way, I heard no more from General Ramke. However, he must have changed his mind about conducting a fanatical defence. Otherwise, he could not have appeared as the commander of the coastal fortress of Brest, France, in the summer of 1944. I proceeded to the Corps Group's main command post to report the displacement of my forward command post. I explained that the Russians had simply come too close for comfort. I advised him that, based on my observations of the speed of the Russian advance, I believed that the enemy could not be far from the main command post either. In fact, I said, one should be able to observe his advanced elements already from the end of town. We beat a rather speedy departure. Ultimately, my suggestion to emplace a machine gun at the command post was not discussed any further. My next job was that of a crossing site commander at a pontoon bridge crossing the Ukrainian river Bug between Savran and Pervomaisk. A bridge commander's mission is to regulate the progress of traffic over the bridge and, if necessary, to destroy it when the time is right. In this mission, I was supported by a unit of field gendarmes who actually controlled the traffic across the span, checked passes and orders, and so on. This meant sometimes assigning priority to a unit if it is justified and necessary. An example would be a fighting unit which was moving towards the enemy and therefore needed right-of-way. I was never confronted with such a case. During the campaign in France in 1940, this was almost the rule, because everybody feared to be too late. When it comes to withdrawals, much less to retreats, it would be best to appoint a field marshal as bridge commander instead of a Hauptmann. Nothing is more difficult than to make a superior officer understand that here at the bridge commander has to make decisions in the name of his respective superior. In my entire career, I had never drawn so many chewings out from colonels, majors, staff officers, and so on, in one case even from a major general, as during these 2 days on my bridge. The field gendarmes, the so-called chain dogs, were absolutely deaf when it came to chastisement or upbraiding by superior officers not in their chain of command, including massive threats with courts-martial and so forth. I decided I could learn quite a bit from them. The most critical task of a bridge commander is to destroy the bridge at the precise moment. To ensure safe passage of every possible friendly unit, bridges must not be destroyed 1 second too soon. To ensure that the enemy cannot pursue withdrawing friendly forces across the bridge, for God's sake don't blow the damn thing 1 second too late. The ideal moment to push the plunger on the firing mechanism is when the last friendly soldier who needs to cross steps off the bridge and the first bad guy starts to get on it. Unfortunately, it rarely works out this way. Some of us may remember that Hitler ordered Major Scheller, the site commander at the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in March 1945, to be shot because the fuse for the explosive charge failed as a result of enemy fire. Thus, the bridge fell into the hands of the Americans rather undamaged. It is unfortunate that no superior officer dared to prevent that brutal, senseless execution. In those 2 days, I did not once close an eye. During daytime, I continuously watched the bridge and kept contact by sight with the pioneer sergeant, who had to handle the plunger connected to the electric fuse. At night, I stood at the north bank and listened into the darkness. In addition, there were listening posts in front of the bridge at all times. Enemy units could show up at the bridge ahead of the last rear guard, or even ahead of dispersed groups of our own. After 2 days, the retreating listening posts reported that the Russians were concentrically approaching our bridge. We cleared off from the bridge, and I then gave the signal for the detonation. In many instances, the detonation of a bridge is of questionable importance. Troops with modern equipment can hardly be stopped, even by a blown-up bridge. After the detonation, the middle spans of our bridge floated slowly downriver. The northern and southern parts of the bridge washed up on the corresponding banks. From a small hill, we saw Russians at the river, and then returned to the Corps command post, where we found that we were only protected by a thin line of patrols. None of us could know if any of our own people were left behind on the north bank of the river. Considerable doubt remains in my mind to this day. My last, somewhat out-of-context job in Russia was that of a town commander. I believe the name of the town was Secretaria, or something similar. It was spaced out like all the towns in that part of the Soviet Empire, where a few square kilometers more or less don't matter. In the evening hours, when I entered one of the few bigger, sturdier buildings to find out who and what was in it, I found it stuffed full of German Lancers. Even though some were badly wounded, it seemed apparent that nobody cared about them. I was so perplexed that I literally could not utter a word. When I found my tongue, I promised the wounded that I would do everything I could to get them moved out of there. I walked briskly to a radio position and asked if they could make contact with any higher staff, maybe the army staff. The operators answered in the affirmative. Then I asked them to send a radio message to the army that there are many heavily wounded in Secretaria, and it is no longer possible to transport them by land. Could transport via air be carried out? Signed, Battle Commander Secretaria. The answer from Army headquarters was, yes, tomorrow after daybreak. Mark landing strip, keep wounded ready in immediate proximity. When I returned to the town command post, I found a very good-looking Russian woman there, of German descent, who was probably dropped off here by some supply unit before it left Russia. In tears, she begged me to help her. The next morning I arranged for the selection and marking of a landing strip for the transport plane, which was so ardently awaited. The only possible place we could find was a totally soaked meadow, and I had most serious qualms about having a transport plane land there. I did not have any other choice, since the wounded were already waiting, full of hope, next to the selected landing strip. When the Junkers 52 appeared at low altitude on the horizon, we could only keep our fingers crossed. Thank God the landing went well, but the undercarriage sank at least 10 centimeters into the soggy ground. After disembarking, the crew members walked around their bird, shaking their heads. The pilot, a young sergeant, said, "I don't know if I can take off from here, even with the plane being empty." But we loaded anyway, at least all those who could, with all certainty, not survive ground transportation. The young aviator, resigned to God's will, stood by and maybe counted the possibility that he might have to return to his squadron on foot. We who stayed behind promised him that we would push with all our strength, which he acknowledged with a tired smile. But the miracle happened. Almost at the end of the meadow, the plane climbed sluggishly aloft, stalled briefly, but finally flew away, while heavy clumps of clay fell off the undercarriage to the ground. When I returned to the town command centre, I was again greeted by my Russian woman from the night before, and I assured her again that I would take care of further transportation for her. Just when I put my arm around her shoulder to console her, the general appeared in the door. I reported, "Town command centre without any special occurrences," which he accepted in view of the facts with a smirk. Then he wanted to know about the cargo plane he just saw. When I informed him about what I discovered last night and consequently set in motion, he was highly amazed that I succeeded in these days to organize, practically unaided, aerial evacuation for wounded soldiers. It seemed to him almost like a miracle. It seemed like one to me, too. During our next required withdrawal towards the Romanian border, I almost fell from my horse due to weakness. My temperature was almost 41 degrees centigrade, about 106 degrees Fahrenheit. Somewhere I was put on a hospital train on which I left Russia for good. It was almost at the same spot where, in 1941, our division had started its advance towards Russia, crossing the border river Pruth. Now, in April 1944, almost 3 hard years of war, full of deprivation, were behind the gallant 198th Infantry Division, yet all the sacrifices were in vain. Little by little, the hospital train took me to Galați, Romania, and during this time I recovered enough to make me want to return to the troops. In Galați, I had the opportunity to fly to Bacău on a dispatch plane. If I remember well, beginning in April 1944, this was the location of the 8th Army staff. In any event, I had gone from a saddle onto a train during wet and cold weather, just the way I was, carrying nothing with me. No underwear, no socks, nothing. Just my uniform and those heavy felt winter boots. In the meantime, beautiful spring weather had arrived in Romania. I almost felt like a bum among the well-clad Romanians and the sharply dressed soldiers of our rear echelon elements. This became very clear to me when I tried to get information about the current location of the 198th Infantry Division from the 8th Army staff. The chain dog at the main entrance of the impressive building serving as residence of the staff wouldn't even let me enter. That's how shocked he was by my sad appearance. He then relented and at least allowed me into the lobby. It had an aura of noble calmness. With curiosity, I read the signs on those huge French doors. Demigods all. They included the Army Commander, Chief of Staff, LA, LBIC, First Aide-de-Camp, and so on. Sometimes one of the doors opened quietly, and an elegantly clad military gentleman strode across the hall and disappeared behind another door. Sharply creased trousers, mostly with red stripes, and highly polished shoes seemed to be the rule here. I looked down at myself and began to be ashamed. Nobody noticed me anyway, until one of the chain dogs had pity on me and offered to find out where the command post of my division was supposed to be at this time. Once I got the information, I promptly proceeded to the Army motor pool, and there I found a truck that was going in the corresponding direction. In the second half of April, I reached the division, or more accurately, what was left of it. It was in Roman, some 60 kilometers west of the Pruth, the border river between Russia and Romania. In the imagination of our highest commander-in-chief, Roman too was apparently supposed to become a stronghold, or even a fortress. In any case, right after my return, I was entrusted with the management of the construction of fortifications around Roman. If I was informed correctly at that time, an agreement with the Romanian head of state, Marshal Ion Antonescu, stated that no measures could be taken against the Jewish part of the Romanian population. But the Jews came by the thousands, probably under duress, to work on the bulwarks. They were mostly deployed where they lived, and so I set up a 2-hour break at noontime every day to enable these people to eat at home. At some time or another, I was appointed liaison officer with the Romanians. My impression of the plain soldiers was positive, but regrettably it was not so of their officers. Most of the soldiers were unpretentious sons of farmers, since Romania was, as it is to this day, a fertile agrarian country. The officer corps came almost exclusively from the large cities and was heavily Francophiliac. These officers seemed none too anxious to get near the fighting. When I mentioned to the Romanian officers that their staffs were much too far removed from the front, they responded that there was sufficient telephone wire available. There were other indications of problems with their leadership. Several times I was invited to dine at a Romanian division command post. Each time it was a big dinner of several courses, and the affairs could go on for hours. Yet I never saw the regular soldiers eat anything else but one-pot meals, consisting mostly of big beans. The German officer corps had a different attitude in that matter. The German company commander was last in line at the field kitchen. This was tradition. On the 11th of May 1944, the 198th Infantry Division was reassigned from 8th Army, and General der Infanterie Otto Wohler, its commanding general, gave them a heartfelt farewell. In 1984, I had the pleasure of a telephone conversation with the 90-year-old general, who was spending his golden years in his home and birthplace, Gross-Bergwedel. The division was to be reconstituted in a training camp in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. I had asked for home leave, which I was granted. It was one of the few I had during the war, and it also became my last one. Barely 10 months later, the Red Army swamped my East Prussian homeland. I spent my short leave in a convalescent home for officers in the once so elegant Sopot, which was well known to me since my childhood. When my leave was over, I had to report to the replacement centre in Dresden. There I learned, as a great surprise to me, that my destination would not be the Protectorate, but southern France. I had to ask twice to be sure that the sergeant behind the desk had not made a mistake, It would take a few days for the transportation officer to be able to give me precise information. Before that, they said the exact position of the division was still unknown, so I could stay a few days in beautiful Florence on the Elbe, Dresden, which at this point in time was still without any sign of destruction. It had been declared an open city. One day I visited the world-famous Semper Opera, the builder of which had also created the Burg Theatre in Vienna. Another time I went to see the Volksopera. Out of respect for the many wounded in the hospitals of the city, the repertories preferred light works. 8 months later, of course, Dresden was extinct, totally destroyed in a firestorm caused by Royal Air Force bombing. Russia was now behind me. What we soldiers on the River Maas in 1941 had perceived would happen had come to pass. In our guts, we had known even then that for us the war was lost. Later, many different versions about losing the war circulated. For example, General Major Karl Wagner, one-time Chief of Staff of Army Group South, felt that Hitler's Orders 45, issued on the 23rd of July 1942, after the successful conclusion of the Spring Campaign and the Battle of Kharkov, were probably the decisive cause for the loss of the Russian campaign. The objectives contained in these orders caused an expansion of the front line of the Eastern Front to a total of 4,000 kilometers, including the drive into the Caucasus. It was just too much for an army that had yet to make good its losses of the previous autumn and winter. General Wagner also felt that the OKW always made step 2 inches before step 1, meaning going directly after geographic and economic targets, instead of considering them a gift of a military accomplishment. In another vein, von Manstein believed that the irreversible loss occurred at Stalingrad, and that it came about as a result of a combination of mistakes. He thought that covering the whole northern flank of the Sixth Army, fighting around Stalingrad with almost exclusively non-German units, Hungarian, Italian, but mostly Romanian, was an unusually high risk. This enticed the Russians, who were always exceptionally well informed, to start their penetration of the front lines right there, and ultimately to destroy the Sixth Army as well, in the huge encirclement that was our debacle at Stalingrad. We valued the Romanian units as the best of our allies, but based on my observations of their leadership, I feel that leadership in the field should have been given to their Field Marshal and Chief of State, Antonescu. He was an effective soldier and expressed his willingness to take over the command. Looking over the strategic map of our Army Group South in the fall of 1942, one did not have to be a field marshal to understand what an enormous, immeasurable risk our highest leadership had taken at Stalingrad. There are many other explanations for our loss in the East. To those of us at the front, it seemed as if the decision-makers in the higher command had lost their senses. In the presence of my division commander and his staff, I once stated, "Our highest leadership at this time only knows 2 principles: comb out the rear echelons and hold positions. We seem to have forgotten everything else." Whatever the problems were, though, it is difficult to comprehend that all our experienced, talented and trained generals, as well as general staff officers, did not succeed in forcing their convictions upon the OKW and Hitler, for once. In my opinion, this was truly the real reason for our greatest failure, that of our army in the Russian gambit. During my trip to southern France, I stopped over once more in Paris and found it to be almost unchanged, in spite of the invasion being in full swing. But the train I took 2 days later through the Rhône Valley further south was overcrowded. It seemed as if every Frenchman who could afford it was travelling south to escape the expected battles in northern France. After arriving in Narbonne and reporting to the division staff, I learned about the awards that had been assigned to my colleague, Dr. Majer, and me for the last difficult weeks and months in Russia. Bielaya Zherkov, Luka, Votilevka, Tikonovka, Chemeriskoye, Uman, those had only been the climaxes of these trying times. As of the 1st of April 1944, we were both promoted to major and reconfirmed as commanders of our battalions. Sometime later, I also received the German Cross in Gold for actions in Russia in early 1944. Although I had no way of knowing it at the time, the promotion to major would be my last. I remember well the consequences of my first promotion to a leadership position. On the 1st of June 1934, I was promoted to Obergefreiter, thereby joining the ranks of the old men who could get away with calling 5 an even number. Shortly thereafter, I was sent, unexpectedly, for NCO training in Aris. The course lasted 3 months and had almost 500 students. The fact, however, that I graduated 5th in the class of these 500, the highest-ranking graduate from my company, apparently did not impress Erwin the Only in the least. From that point forward, he did not trust me. My quick transformation from Saul to Paul was obviously too much for him. To Erwin the Only, I was now ambitious and career-oriented. After our return from the course, he had a few words for us and, as a side remark, stated that he did not appreciate ambitious people. I did not expect to hear any words of acknowledgement, let alone praise, as they were reserved strictly for his favourites. For me, it was only important that at least he could not bawl me out for my especially good grades. Soon after that, I escaped from him for another 3 months, because I was invited to be an instructor for the very next course at the NCO school. When I returned this time, there was a big surprise waiting. One of the Hauptmann's favourite sergeants, I suspected him of also being a listening post, requested me as a squad leader in his platoon. I wasn't sure if he wanted me for my good evaluation or if Erwin thought I would be well taken care of under the nurturing wing of one of his intimates. There was a well-known motto among the infantrymen, "Enjoy the war, peace will be terrible." Thus, we spent the few weeks that remained in radiant sunshine of the Mediterranean coast until the beginning of the invasion of the French Riviera. But all of us, especially those from the eastern part of the Reich, were concerned about what the future would bring. On the 20th of August, following an intense barrage, 90 Russian divisions and 40 tank brigades crossed the River Prut and flooded Romania. Then, on the 24th of August, Romania broke off relations with the Reich and the following day declared war on Germany. The break-off of Romania created a desperate situation for the German 6th and 8th armies. The new 6th Army, re-established after Stalingrad, was completely annihilated, as was about half of the 8th Army. 16 German divisions were lost, and the fate of 8,000 missing in action remained forever unaccountable. This made us realize what unimaginable good fortune our division was granted when we were shipped out of Romania. The 198th Infantry Division took over a huge section of the Mediterranean coast, reaching from the peak of the Pyrenees almost to the delta of the Rhone River. My regiment was assigned the southernmost part, the right wing of which ended directly at the Spanish border. My colleague Major resided in Château Valmy near Perpignan, situated picturesquely against the impressive backdrop of the Pyrenees. My slightly more modest residence was Maison Rouge, near the road from Perpignan to Canet-Plage. In addition to the highly touted Atlantic Wall, the propaganda ministry occasionally talked about a Mediterranean wall. My little Oberst Neuiger would probably have commented on that with, "Well, if you want to call that a wall." I am not aware of anything that was built that could legitimately have been called fortification in the sector of my regiment. Our predecessors had built dugouts of the most primitive type, which would not even survive shelling from the lightest artillery. Personally, if I were under fire, I would rather have dug into the flat sand, instead of looking for shelter in such a dugout. Some of them were constructed of brick, believe it or not, and plastered with cement, somewhat like a stucco house. The organisation TOT, OT, did actually exist in Perpignan, and occasionally could be seen surveying something somewhere, but with that their activity was exhausted. Sometimes I visited the OT bureau in Perpignan to discuss problems with the construction of positions. The only result was that I once invited a very attractive secretary for an excursion to Port Bou on the Spanish side of the Pyrenees. As Spain remained neutral, it could happen that one was seated at the same table with English or Americans in a restaurant. We Germans in our uniforms were always treated especially nicely by the Spaniards. In any case, I could not spend one single peseta during my visit to Port Bou. Whatever my companion and I consumed was paid for by a nice Spaniard. Had I then known that at that time a cousin of mine by marriage was the German consul general in Barcelona, I might have extended my trip to Spain. Because of its location at the border, Port Boo was presumably a preferred place for agents from both sides who, after all, seemed to know each other. A young man came to my table and asked to talk to me for a moment. He stated that my companion was under observation by the Gestapo for suspicion of espionage. I considered this nonsense and a case of showing off. When he demanded that I return with the lady at once to France, I declared that I would return in the evening, as planned, but not earlier. What a pity that at that time I did not know of the existence of my cousin in Barcelona. We exchanged our vital statistics, but I never again heard from this young man. After I reported the incident to my nice Bavarian Oberst, he called and gave hell to the local Gestapo Obersturmführer in charge of this agent, which the Oberst could well afford to do, being an intimate friend of Heinrich Himmler. My companion later mentioned that she knew the boy, and that he repeatedly tried to score with her in Perpignan. So that's how it was. Again our division was worked into shape for the umpteenth time. Men and arms were replenished and small exercises were undertaken. Besides this, as mentioned earlier, we enjoyed the few pleasant weeks that remained. But in some way, everything we did in those days seemed already to be more and more senseless. In early June, we received a new division commander, General Major Otto Richter. His arrival only reinforced this idea in our minds. At this point, it may be instructive to look back on the commanding generals under whom we had served in the 198th Infantry Division during the war. The outgoing division commander, Generalleutnant von Horn, was the former military attaché in Paris before the war, and went on to the same duty position in Switzerland after relinquishing command in 1944. General von Horn grew up in a family that came from a long line of civil servants. In fact, the family had been raised to the hereditary nobility for such service in the middle of the 19th century. His grandfather, Karl von Horn, was for some time Oberpräsident of my East Prussian home province. Generalleutnant von Horn's father was also a general, whose sister Doris von Horn had married the future Generalfeldmarschall von Mackensen. Von Horn came to us as an Oberst IG, and after a short period at the front was promoted to General Major. He did not need to procure authority, he had it. Cutting an elegant figure, with the cool, self-confident manners of a grand seigneur, he could, with perfect courtesy, keep anyone at a distance. He was not a charismatic leader of his men, not one whom one would find at the front of his fighting units, brandishing an automatic weapon. But neither would he complain about a headache. Officers, NCOs and soldiers all naturally and implicitly respected and trusted him. The first two combat commanders of the 198th Infantry Division were troop officers. Generalleutnant Otto Roetig, who commanded the division until the 10th of April 1942, had been a regimental commander in Lüneburg before the war. General Major Albert Buck, the Swabian who succeeded him, was, before the war, a battalion commander in Ulm on the Danube. Buck was killed in action on the 6th of September 1942, together with his Major Bull. Then came General Major Ludwig Müller, who commanded until von Horn took over on the 7th of February 1943. I didn't know Müller, who commanded only while I was assigned to the reserve unit in France during my convalescence. The new commander, General Major Otto Richter, originally came from the 48th Pioneer Battalion in Breslau. He assumed command on the 3rd of June 1944, and on the 29th of August was taken prisoner by the Americans. I think that, as a commander, he was decidedly inferior to his predecessors. It must have been increasingly difficult for the Personnel Bureau to fill positions of high command with worthy occupants. In 1944, hundreds of division commanders were needed, and in addition, the higher command positions and staffs had to be filled. The available pool was obviously more than empty. An example of Richter's shortcomings may suffice to explain why we felt less confidence in him than in his predecessors. At the outset of his tenure in command, he gathered all commanders of his division for a party, at his personal expense, in Narbonne. In the best officers' club manner, he toasted each individual group of guests for more than an hour. The gentlemen regimental commanders, the gentlemen battalion commanders, the gentlemen separate detachment commanders, the gentlemen medical officers, the gentlemen of the division supply train, and so forth, on and on and on. There was no opportunity for congenial conversation among the invited, who would have gladly used this opportunity to get to know one another. As dispersed as our division was, many of us barely knew the others by name. Nevertheless, Richter's lean figure stood straight as an arrow in the big room, and he was obviously enjoying himself. Of course, with every new toast, the conversation was interrupted. The persons addressed got up from their seats politely, but obviously displeased, and returned the general's toast. Had he realized what the roughly 150 participants later had to say about him and the circus he brought about, he would not have been very content with his investment. Clearly, this was a man more interested in form than in function, and in war there is little room for that. Other factors beyond Richter's shortcomings also contributed to the growing doubt felt by many of us. During his command, there was depressing news from all fronts. In the summer of 1944, the front in the east was disintegrating, and the Allies were breaking out in Normandy. The news of the 20th of July, 1944, however, was the outstanding event. At 12:42 p.m., a powerful detonation interrupted the presentation of the war situation in the presence of Hitler at Rastenburg. 4 completely uninvolved men at once fell victim to the bomb, but of course Hitler survived practically unscathed. Other persons were more or less seriously injured. The failed coup would have consequences reaching far into the post-war era. On the evening of the 20th of July, I was called to the telephone. At the other end was my usually nice Bavarian Oberst and Regimental commander, who furiously fumed to me that an attempt had been made on the Führer's life in Rastenburg, yet Hitler, hardly wounded, was still alive. The assailant and his cohorts, I was told, came from a very small clique of miserably dissatisfied, cowardly officers, and so on. By name, he only mentioned von Stauffenberg. Born in 1907, Klaus Graf Schenk von Stauffenberg was a career officer, and until his appointment to the Staff College, was an officer of the Cavalry Regiment 17 in Bamberg. His comrades from the Staff College and close personal friends during his days at the military school, Obersts Eberhard Fink and Merz von Kernheim, were also involved on the 20th of July and were later executed. As a young officer, Stauffenberg was an ardent follower of Hitler, as were his above-mentioned friends. Stauffenberg stepped on a mine in North Africa, whereby he lost an eye and suffered considerable wounds to his right arm and hand. Nevertheless, he was retained in service, and in 1943 he was promoted to Oberstleutnant. In 1944 he was promoted to Oberst. At the age of only 37, he was Chief of the General Staff to the Commander of the Reserve Army, headquartered in Berlin. I would call that a satisfactory military career. This was what I mentioned to Oberstleutnant Gumbel on that fateful night. I further opined that it raised my doubts that professional dissatisfaction alone could have been the motive for the attempt on Hitler's life. The Oberstleutnant then became quite angry and ordered me to report to him immediately. In matters of National Socialism, the bearer of the blood order could not take a joke. By all means, he said, I could rest assured that I was not in danger due to my utterances. My commander was much too decent a character to turn me in for such a commentary. It only came to a serious lesson, a personal verbal admonishment, as I suspected. After the 20th of July, we had barely 4 weeks to spend at the Mediterranean. On the 14th of August, we were alerted, since enemy landing forces were spotted by the Luftwaffe approaching the Mediterranean coast of France. On the morning of the 15th of August, the Allies landed between Toulon and Cannes,